Yeah, so for the first interview, the kids generated a list of questions, and then we did a QFT where we identified which questions were closed and which were open. And this is after watching your closed and open video. And then I had the kids, we then graphed how many closed questions we had and how many open. And there was it was like 17 to 5, in each group of closed to open questions. And then, they had to try and change some of their closed into open questions. And then we discussed, why we would want an open question, because it would get you to a story. It gets you to the juicy, fun details. It also gets the person you're interviewing doing more of the talking. If you ask closed questions, then it's all you, and you're getting these short responses that you can't really build upon. So that was like the first part. And then we took a lot of those open questions, and the kids either wrote their own list of questions, or for some of their struggling writers, I created a list of open-ended questions and some closed questions that they could go home and ask their family member in the first interview.
And we started with the read write thing. They had that whole page of questions.
Yes,
so that, and I'm sorry, another teacher and I kind of went through that. And so we started with that. And so the kids went through and they had to decide which ones were open, which ones were closed. Then we did the QFT. And then at that point, they picked their two favorites. We also did the find which ones are closed, find which ones are open, which would lead you to have better answers and really getting those juicy details. And then we made like kind of a class list, and they had an idea of what they wanted to find out from their parents already. And so from kind of that class list and the list that they had generated with their tables and the other from Read Writes, they created their list in my class. That's kind of how they did it for them to take home for that first interview.
Yeah.
And that was just paper and pencil.
Yep.
We hadn't started the video. They just were going to go home and interview. And then when we came back the next day, that is when I had my kids paired up. And so they were talking with their partners, and we were trying to figure out, okay, which questions really led to getting them some really good, juicy answers, and then where do I want to know a little bit more about? So that's where we talked about, now we got to zoom in, because there's a lot of information here. Now let's zoom in so we can really, really, really try to figure out that story.
I kind of presented it. I had this image of a bookshelf that was shaped like a human head, and I presented it to them that your first interview is you going to the library and pulling out all the different books and looking at the book jackets and kind of like, just checking into all these different stories that are on the shelf that's in the memory. And then the second interview was going to be where you actually pull a book off the shelf, and that's the book that you were going to really read and get deep into. And I think that kind of helped the kids understand why we were doing two sets of interviews, because you couldn't just go straight in with, I want to find out more about this story, because you don't even know what stories your parents have, or a family member.
Right. So for the folks who are considering replicating this project, we're doing this how-to video because we want people to understand that there were many different moving parts in this experience, and to excise one moving part in the interest of time might not yield the same rich thinking, the same full experience that we wanted for kids. So for me, part of the more gratifying part of this experience for me was being able to watch the students' video reflections. Can you guys talk about the importance and the manner in which you had kids reflect on their thinking throughout, right? I'm really thinking here toward the end of the experience, but why was it so important for kids to reflect on this experience, and then how did you set kids up to reflect in meaningful ways about the experience?
When we think about really powerful, culturally responsive teaching, we think about the reflection part. Both the teacher reflecting and the student reflecting. When you reflect, as you know, within ourselves, that reflective piece is so important within the learning process. And I think that for kids to make that connection of why this was such an important learning experience was that reflection. I mean, that really solidifies, why are we doing this? What does it mean to me? And how can I use it from now on?
Yeah. I think we did reflecting through this process with the kids. Like we would do mixed pair shares. Like, what are you learning? How are you feeling? And I have to say, in the first few weeks, it felt like it wasn't going where. I mean, I thought like, oh, they're gonna have these great rich stories, and they're gonna be like so deep into their. And some of the stories that they were coming back with, I was like, no. I would totally choose a different story. Like your mom has so much cooler stories, but but the kids in doing the reflecting, like you could see through this unit them going deeper and deeper, because even if they didn't go back and try a story that would have been maybe something they could emotionally connect to more, in their reflections at the end is where I think I felt that we had hit this, we had done this correct, because their reflections were what I wanted.
It is so important for us as teachers in that reflective piece. Like, step away, take yourself out of this experience. This is not about you, it is about them, it is about what their journey is, and just guide. Just as you are just their little facilitator, and you're guiding them along. And even if you're like, that is about to crash and burn, you let them figure that crash and that burn. And what we thought was going to crash and burn was like this beautiful, incredible story. So we have a perception, we have our own bias, we have our own perceptions of what we think is supposed to be, which usually is nothing what it ends up being.
Well,
when we had to be, and I remember us as a team talking about, it was
messy.
so hard for me. I wanted to like save them or do this, and then afterwards talking about how important it was that we didn't. I just feel like that,
Well, and then I was going to say that it lent to so much vulnerability within the classroom, with students getting in front of the cameras and being able to really reflect upon the experience and to talk about how it had changed them.
Yes.
You're talking about being aware of that feeling of anxiousness, being aware of that feeling of anxiety, when you realize I'm not so in control here. But the point that I always like to make to teachers is that if your students are truly engaged in rigorous thinking, if they are analyzing, if they are interpreting, if they are synthesizing, particularly with their own text that they are expected to become the expert on, when they are truly engaged in the most rigorous thinking, you can't possibly be in control. They're making connections that are impossible for you to see. They've got to make the connections and then articulate the connections. When they do that, they fully own the learning experience. All we're there to do is just to continue to support them and to push them forward, but it's all theirs.
Throughout the entire process, I kept going back to that thought of what do I really want kids to feel during this, and that's that connection. But you said it perfectly. You can't be rigid. You have to. It's a ever flowing. It's like a river. There are going to be big boulders. There's going to be tiny little rocks, but you have to really be watching your students, understanding where your students are. Every class is going to be different. You're not going to be able to say this is a one size fits all. I went in every day expecting one thing to happen, something completely different might have happened. And so being prepared for everything that's going to happen and being okay with that, and not, this is not, my lesson plan says this, so I'm going to do this. It's that you have to give up a lot of control.
In terms of being overly rigid, as you guys are describing, to use your word, but I hear you saying, you got to correct me if I'm wrong, being too rigid means prioritizing the activity plan, prioritizing what I wanted my kids to do over what I wanted my kids to understand and what I wanted my kids to feel.
Right.
What I hear you all saying is that being prepared to make a deviation in the activity plan and what my students were doing gave you guys better and clearer opportunities to prioritize their thinking, to be responsive to how they were showing up as intellectual beings.
Yes.
So the success of the experience was not a function of did they do the activities. The success of the experience is a function of were they thinking in the ways that I wanted them to think? Were they feeling what I wanted them to feel? I think that was really, really important.
And I have to say, with a project like this, when we do UBDs and you ask that big essential question and you ask that big understanding, all of your lessons, all of your activities, even your final products can be completely different, which is delightful.
Yes.
Because I don't know any teacher that likes to teach exactly the same thing that everybody else is teaching. And that doesn't work because then the next year is completely different. So having that big understanding really was the most important part
Yes.
of this project, and understanding the heart of it. And I think it was when you explain essential learnings or understandings, it is what they're going to understand until they're an adult.
Yes.
This is not an academic only thing. This is not, oh, Park is going to test it. This is a Common Core standard. This is a life understanding. And I think that was the biggest thing with this project.
Something strikes me as immensely important for kiddos over the course of these weeks where they are capturing the text from their families' lives. You had to somehow communicate to your kids that the stories that they were collecting about their family members are just as rich and interesting and valuable to us as the stories that we are reading about in literature. Can you think about how were you able to support your students in honoring the text that they were collecting in the ways that we really wanted them to feel?
Well, I think asking the question why. So after their first interview and they came back and they had to choose one topic or one question that they were going to delve deeper into, asking them why that was important was a good way to get them deep. And I think that was a really good step because it really made them think about, like, well, why am I choosing this? Like, why is this interesting? And some of the kids changed their question. Some of them stuck with it. And then after they did their interview, they were like, oh, really wasn't the best. But I think that's another thing that we did too, is we allowed failure. We had to allow it because the whole point of this was that the responsibility to go deeper was on your shoulders. And so not everybody goes deep right away. It's their first time doing this. It's their first rodeo. So you got to fall off the horse a couple times. And I think that was a big teaching step for me, is allowing it, going, oh my gosh, this question is not going to get that deep, but cool, that's what you want to do. But like, it was big for me to have to step back and allow the failure. And they came to a lot of conclusions from it.
Having that mindset that this was their journey. This was not our journey.
Yes.
And
completely.
we're guiding your journey, and we can, like, maybe guide you a little bit, like, well, look at that beautiful question. They're like, don't like it. All right, go home and try that, and try this to try to figure out if it works. And really taking us out of that equation. And then having those deep questions, or having those conversations about, well, why did it work? Like you were saying, why didn't it work? I think it's just as important to have those conversations of why didn't it work, and so that they can really identify what they need, the next steps that they need to do.